Well, welcome everyone to this new session of the AEPF 13. You know, this forum normally takes time every 2 years, and of course we do this normally live. But sadly, we are now meeting in a digital world, all sitting in our rooms and offices. However, I think we can say that we are still one big AEPF family. For those who might not know, APF is an Asia-European network committed to foster people's solidarity for a socially and economically just, inclusive, peaceful, sustainable, and ecological sensitive development within and across two regions. The aim to advance people's voices and visions within Asia-Europe relations. That's why we are this week organizing a week full of interesting panels where people can exchange, have the opportunity to learn and debate. And in fact, this all will contribute to the APF final statement that we will say bring and produce to the Assam summit later this year. Assam is in fact, the meeting of Asian and European leaders, which also takes place every 2 years. This panel is organized by APMDD, the Asia People's Movement on Debt and Development, based in Manila, with members all over the Asian continent. APMDD is an alliance of people's movements, community organizations, coalitions, NGOs, and networks, tackling a number of strategic issues, such as climate justice, global finance, tax and fiscal justice, and gender equality. I'm your moderator of today. I'm Chris van Slambroek, working for Triple 11, a coalition of Belgian NGOs based in Brussels, with offices in Manila, in Lima, Peru, and also in Central Africa, DRC Congo, Central Africa. And we are also working on three major topics, which is ecological justice, social economic justice, and democratic justice. Today I have, in fact, the honor to moderate this wonderful panel, in which we will focus on climate finance and do a kind of a reality check. Why is climate finance an essential part of the climate debate? That's, I think, is an important question. How do we define climate debt and how does it relate to the climate finance topic? Why do we hear little about climate reparations, taking into account that historical contributions to the climate crisis are regionally extremely unbalanced? And last but not least, what are the ways forward? What battles are waiting for us in 2021 and beyond? Without further ado, I will come to the first, the first two speakers who will give a perspective on climate debt and why a debate on reparations is strategic but also a challenge. And I think we will hear two voices, one of Lydia Nakpil, who is already among us. Lydia is a lifelong human rights activist and currently the coordinator of APMDD, the host of this event. And she's also convener, or is it co-convener of the international campaign to demand climate justice. So she will bring, in fact, the southern perspective, and then she will be followed by Lien van Damme, my colleague at Triple 11, who is the climate justice officer, policy officer, and also, say, active in the Belgian Climate Coalition. So, Liddy, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to have a PowerPoint to help me in the presentation this afternoon. It's been a great 3 days of discussion of climate change and the need to act for climate justice now. So our topic this afternoon, well, early evening in Manila. I don't know what time it is in Brussels. is reparations for climate debt. But in discussing this, I'd just like to maybe review some of the urgent points that comprise our context for discussing climate justice now. We know that it's one of the most urgent global crises that we are facing today, and it has deep impacts for the entire planet, but especially for the peoples of the South who bear the brunt of its effects. But I'd like to just underscore that women, indigenous peoples, workers, farmers, fishers, migrants, people of color, ethnic communities are even more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of the multiple layers of oppression that they have to face. We know that the immediate cause of this crisis is the historically accumulated, excessively high concentration and continuous huge emissions of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also have to underscore the destruction of natural carbon sinks. All of this principally by rich industrialized countries and by big transnational corporations and global elites. One word is missing there. It is not just the type of energy source that's often been discussed, fossil fuels as the cause, but we should also include in that equation the excessive and exponentially increasing use of fossil fuels based energy that is inherent in an economic system that involves first the unrestrained extraction of natural resources and the commons being subject to private ownership and abused for purposes that serve only a few, the destruction of ecosystems and the overproduction of commodities, the pursuit of hegemony by corporations and the elite capture of states, as well as geomilitary and political conflicts, and all of this driven by the use of fossil fuels for the relentless pursuit of profits. The history of sharp increase in greenhouse gas emissions coincides with the emergence and growth of capitalism. And in the last 40 years, the most rapid increases have been happening under the period of neoliberal globalization. Even the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change recognizes that the period of excessive emissions and accumulation of greenhouse gases is linked to industrialization. That is often mentioned, and the pre-industrialization period is the reference point for bringing greenhouse gas emissions down. There has to be a profound transformation, and we say this over and over again, lest we forget that in order to stop catastrophic climate change, there has to be system change. And in order to enable people and communities to deal with its impacts, system change is also necessary. And this process of profound transformation involves immediate, medium-term, and long-term changes globally and within each country. And since we are now facing the most crucial decade in the fight for climate justice, the fact that the world needs to reach real zero emissions by 2050 is of urgent concern, but that cannot happen without reparations for climate debt. And that is why we are talking about it this afternoon. Climate debt is owed by those responsible for unhampered excessive greenhouse gas emissions, cumulatively using more than their fair share of atmospheric space, and for the destruction of Earth's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases. The accumulation of this debt is played out on a scale encompassing relations among countries and within countries and spanning centuries. But this evening, we're just discussing this climate debt across countries. There's a lot of discussions that still can be had about climate debt within each country. So looking at the world, we know that rich industrialized countries have the largest contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. Roughly 75% of global historical emissions have been generated by countries with only nearly 25% of the Earth's population. Governments of rich industrialized countries are responsible for policies that drive, reinforce, and perpetuate the system that is causing the climate crisis. Transnational corporations, big banks, and international financial institutions finance, invest, and run industries that are mainly responsible for the climate crisis. And within each country, rich elites benefit the most from the system and contribute a larger share to the emissions, exercise political and power and influence over governments and institutions, and own and control the corporations. So we need to mention each time it's governments, it's corporations, financial institutions, and the elites. Fair sharing and reparations. We will not be able to keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius and stop climate catastrophe without ambition and fair sharing of global climate actions. And the notion of fair sharing includes the notion of reparations, which we are emphasizing today. So fair sharing must be based on science. It must be based on a scientific calculation of the share of responsibility for historical and continuing accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and capacity, especially because the accumulation of wealth by rich countries have been driven by the same system that produced the climate crisis. The historical and continuing emissions of rich industrialized countries are so huge that to pay their emissions debt, to do their fair share of mitigation, they need to reach negative emissions by 2030. This means reaching real zero domestically, plus financing the balance of mitigation obligations to take place in the global south. So just to give you one of the examples of calculation of fair shares, the yellow shaded part, is what they must reach at the very least domestically, and the part with the stripes is what they need to be able to achieve, but cannot achieve within their countries because they have to reach zero. You cannot reach negative zero, but that needs to be done in other countries. And therefore, global south countries must undertake their fair share of mitigation actions plus the mitigation balance of the rich countries. So this is what it will look like for the global south. The balance of mitigation obligation of rich countries must be financed. So in many cases in the global south, our fair share is far less than what we have to do to meet the balance of the mitigation obligations of rich countries. So in this graph, you will see the yellow shaded portion as our fair share, and the gray portion there is the share of rich countries that we now have to take on in our own countries, because after reaching real zero domestically, the rest will have to be done elsewhere, and that part must be financed for that part to happen. So again, to emphasize, fair shares of rich countries includes reparations, domestic actions to reach real zero by 2030, plus the delivery of climate finance to meet not only the balance of their share in mitigation, but as well as cover the costs of adaptation and loss and damage in the countries of the South. So climate finance is part of reparations. It is not aid or assistance for countries of the South. Even under the UN Climate Convention, climate finance is defined as an obligation of developed countries to developing countries, recognizing that developed countries shoulder the biggest responsibility for climate change. But for us, we say that it is part of reparations for the huge climate debt owed by the governments, elites, and corporations of rich industrialized countries. Climate debt is only part of a much bigger historical, social, and ecological debt that is acquired through centuries of plunder, exploitation, and destruction. And this debt is still being accumulated today and is many times bigger than the financial debts they are forcing our people to pay. So the question is, where is that climate finance that is part of reparations? And that is what I think the rest of our speakers will be discussing in the next, in the second half of this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lydie, for this say historical background, and I think it's always good to have this historical perspective when we talk about the climate topic. Indeed. Can I invite now Lynn to come with, let's say, how do organizations and governments look in Europe on the topic of climate finance and reparations?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides?
We can see it. Yeah.
Okay, hi, everyone. First of all, thanks for inviting me for this panel. I'm very happy to be here. I think it will be very interesting. And thank you, Lydie, for the great introduction, which is really, I think an encompassing and all round introduction for the discussion that we will have today. So I was indeed invited to give a bit of an introduction on the European perspective on climate debt and climate reparations. And so I will try to do that now. I got some guiding questions, so I will explain more further on. But first, maybe to clarify or just to make clear, I work on a Belgian perspective, so I work mainly on Belgian policies, which is of course very linked to the European agenda and to European policies. But I think much of what I will say will probably be very much steered by the fact that I'm working on a Belgian level, and I think within Europe there are probably very different views and very different perspectives on these discussions. And I think maybe Leah will later on be able to give a bit more of a European perspective on things. So the first question, or the first thing I want to address is whether or not climate debt as a concept, if it's ingrained in European policies and in European policy making. And there, from my Belgian perspective, I would say it's not. It's not established as the main driver of looking at addressing the climate crisis. Climate policies are very much focused on the obligations that are coming from Europe on greenhouse gas emission reductions, on renewable energy production. And there, again, also, we are not doing what is necessary. I will come back to that later. But so this recognition of historic responsibilities that we do see when you talk to policymakers, there are it's not going to happen, or rarely going to happen, that there is a denial of these historic responsibilities. So the recognition is there, and in the lead up to COPs, for example, during the discussions at the COPs, we will get that recognition, but it's not ingrained in the actual policies that are being made, and the minds of the policymakers that are making them. Some examples that I can give, and their international climate finance is of course the most important one. It's also the topic of today. There it's clear, for example, in Belgium, that international climate finance is actually the responsibility of the Minister of Development Cooperation and not the Minister of Climate. So that already shows where the minds are. It's seen as part of solidarity. There's of course also much discussion to be had on whether development cooperation and ODA finance is solidarity, or is of course also part of bigger reparations for this more general that Lydie was talking about. But it's very much seen as something that we have to do on the side. So we have our climate policies, we have our mobility, our agriculture, and our these policies to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's climate policy. And international climate finance, it's something that we can do on the side. Whether in the case we have some extra money, we can give it to international climate finance. That's solidarity, and that's what we will do. This of course is leading to the situation where the money or the commitments are too low. And also, very importantly, the finance that is being given is not additional. In the case of Belgium, up until last year, ODA has been decreasing, and the international climate finance commitments were almost entirely part of this decreasing budget. So in reality, we see less and less money being spent on both ODA and on climate finance in a moment or a time where the challenges are only becoming bigger. So this is, of course, a very big problem. And this shows that that climate debt is not the starting point, and also that what Lily said, that the starting point is not science, it's not what's needed, it's not what developing countries need to reach climate objectives, to ensure safety of all people. It's much more. It's the starting point is much more the Belgian perspective or the European perspective. What can we do? What is economically feasible? And that's the same for ambition. So that's my next point. The European Green Deal, for example, it's an important step, and there are some important aspects to it. So we should not deny that. But the ambition level of the European Green Deal is to reduce emissions by 55%. By 2030. If we then look at the IPCC report on the 1.5, it's clear that global emissions have to have by 2030 to have a chance to stay below 1.5. So taking into account the historic responsibilities and the capacity of a region as the European Union, 55% in 2030 is not enough. European organizations like Can Europe, for example, are asking for 65% in 2030. So there again, in the ambition level, we see that this climate debt perspective is not taken into account. And then very important, and also linked to what Lydie was saying before, it's also being formulated as a growth strategy, where the European Union wants to reach climate objectives and at the same time still focus on GDP growth. By saying that they can decouple GDP growth, from resource use. In fact, we see that that's not possible, that that's not happening. And what is happening is that there is an outsourcing of pollution, of greenhouse gas emissions, of social impacts to other regions in the world. So the growth, the green growth that the European Union is trying to establish is actually leading to more resource extraction in the global south. Is leading, for example, also to massive use of bioenergy, which is again leading to deforestation, loss of biodiversity in other regions of the world. And so there again, we see that this concept of climate debt is not present. And then a third example that I find very important is also the aspect of climate migration. Or climate displacement, where we see that the historic emissions and the climate crisis that is already happening now is leading to displacement in different regions, in different parts of the world, because of extreme weather events, but also slow onset impacts such as sea level rise. And there are no solutions for people that are displaced by climate impacts. And then we see at the global level that there is a recognition, and there is some commitments, for example, in the Global Compact on Migration, but also in the UNFCCC Task Force on Displacement. There were some recommendations that were done. Countries have endorsed these recommendations to increase legal pathways to ensure safety and human rights for people on the run for climate impacts. But in reality, when we look at the European level, we see that the migration policies are going in the completely opposite direction. We see extreme border controls, militarization of the borders, pushbacks to countries like Libya, even development cooperation being used to ensure that people coming to Europe via different migration routes can be held back and cannot reach the European Union. So there again, I would say that's an example of the fact that the European Union is not taking the responsibility that they should. I'm not sure if I'm going over time, so I will be quick about this, because I know that there are some other presentations about whether or not climate finance commitments are being met. The question here was, how are you as European Northern CSOs looking at your European governments to actually see or to assess whether or not they are doing what they have to? And there I would say that the big problem is that there is no agreed definition of a fair share. Lydie before mentioned science, capacity and responsibility, and those are the criteria that we are also using to, for example, count or calculate what the fair share of Belgium should be. But there is a lot of decisions to be made. For example, if you look at responsibility, cumulative emissions, are you going to start in 1850, in 1970, in 1990? That already has big differences. So there is no agreed definition, and there is also a lack of sub-goals in the 100 billion commitment. So it's not clear how much will be private and public, how much will be multilateral and bilateral, how much will be adaptation and mitigation. And this is all this together is leading to accountability issues. And that's leading to free riding. For example, Belgium has a commitment, or had a commitment. At this moment, Belgium doesn't even have a commitment, but has had a commitment of 50 million euros a year for international climate finance. If you compare that to the goal of 100 billion, it's clear that that's not enough. But we don't really have the tools or the instruments to hold Belgium accountable, because there is no international obligation on them to do more, because it's unclear. So I think that's a very big problem in the international climate finance debate. And there I see a big importance for the post-2025 goals. So in Paris, it was agreed that there would be a new objective starting from 2025. The 100 billion is now the floor up until 2025. And these discussions will start in Glasgow this year in COP26. And there is a big challenge there to ensure that there are sub-goals and that there is more accountability. So not only discussions on how high the goal should be, it's clear that it should be much higher than 100 billion, but there should also be discussions on how are we going to ensure that this goal is going to give us more tools to hold countries accountable on whether or not they are meeting the commitment. So this leads me to my last slide on what our positions and demands are. So also a question more on our perspective as CSOs in the global north or in Europe, like how are we going to push for climate debt policies in Europe? And then there I would say again that international climate finance is a priority. I've already mentioned the 100 billion goal. I think COP26 will be a very important moment to hold countries accountable, even though it will be difficult, but to hold them accountable for this commitment and the fact that it's not being met. The post-2025 goal I just explained. And then another thing that I haven't mentioned yet is the lack of finance for adaptation, which is a continuous struggle, and we should keep on stressing this, of course. And then the point, and that is also very much linked to reparations, of course, is the fact that loss and damage is recognized as a pillar in the climate debate, but when it comes to finance and when it comes to ensuring that there are enough resources to actually address loss and damage, of course, historic polluters are very hesitant or very much against that. So that's also a big struggle that will also be important for COP26. And I would be interested to hear your views on how, as CSOs, we can work together to ensure that this will really be an important thing at COP26. And then to conclude, I think, of course, it's not only about finance, it's also about the broader perspective. That's also what Lydie mentioned. It's about debt cancellation. It's about solutions for climate migrants. It's about ensuring a phase out of fossil fuels that is equitable. And it's about having policies. So the concept of policy coherence for development means that policies that we here in Belgium or in the European Union are implementing at least don't have a negative impact somewhere else and actually should have a positive impact in other countries. And so when we're then thinking about the Green Deal as a growth strategy, resource extraction and biofuels and other forms of bioenergy, it's clear that that's not happening. And so that's also very much a fight that we are fighting in the European Union as CSOs. So thank you, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them later.
Okay, Lynn, thanks a lot for this comprehensive overview, and also I think pointing out the challenges we are facing in pushing for say climate justice related to the climate finance topic. And I think indeed when we talk about the whole climate debate is every time it comes back that many agreements are made on a voluntary basis, and that is in fact it's a really challenge to make governments and the policymakers accountable for say decisions that have been agreed upon, but yeah, are lacking real implementation. Thanks, and we now can go over to the next speaker. That is Wanun Permpul. She's, I think, coordinator of the Climate Watch Thailand, an NGO that advocates to change attitudes and development paradigm to promote and ensure climate justice and development justice. Wanun will tell us more about the climate finance as part of climate reparations. I know Wanun has also joined already several COP meetings. We had a chance to meet each other at a few of them. Wanun, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chris, and very good to seeing many of you once again. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share. I'm going to be sharing on what's really happening on the ground and why we really need to have the reparation and climate finance as part of the reparations. So if I can take you to the region, our region, the Asia Pacific, and also Southeast Asia, and also a country like Thailand, are developing countries. And these countries in this region are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. You can name it like flash floods, all those extreme climatic events, and also not many people are talking about slow onsets. So those slow onsets are not, of course, it's not extremely extrematic events happening right away and causing a lot of loss and damages, but it's slowly like sea level rise, even droughts and ecological loss. I take one example of my country, droughts. As I show in this picture, so those droughts have been quite long, and even communities, they have also observed the changes of the weather pattern and even the drought pattern. They don't need scientists to tell them that this is climate change. They even sometimes don't know what climate change means. They don't even know the climate change is somehow linked to the rising temperature and also rising emissions of greenhouse gases. But they have noticed this, that it has been abnormal for the last 30 years. And it's not about the physical change that has been happening, but it's also about the livelihood that have been affecting them. Apart from drought, it's also about the water. So less water or more water would affect the whole ecosystem and also the livelihoods. They have their life depending on this weather pattern and also the climate system. So if water doesn't come, that means it's not about only the lack of water, but that means their livelihood would be destroyed and lost. They don't have food, they don't have money, and also they don't have anything to pay. And also they cannot rely on what's there in the forest for their livelihoods. So it's not just about the impacts on the physical change, but also on the whole social and livelihoods. And also even farmers, it's not just only in Thailand, but also in the Southeast Asia region. Farmers, they do grow not just only rice, but also other fruit crops that they have lived their life and also sell those to earn and to buy for something else and to pay for their livelihood. So storms, big storms or lack of water or more water would affect the products and the yield of these fruits and mangoes. So that would also be really affecting their how are they going to continue their life now and also in the future. As drought, so with a long period of drought, you cannot grow any rice or any crops. And also has been recently happening last 2 months, it's fires. So a long drought period also could cause forest fires, and the forest fires could also happening just next to your door. So it's not just only the loss because of the fire, but it could extend in terms of those impacts because of the fires as well. So all of these are not just happening by accident. It has been observed for the last 30 years. And even a layman or a farmer could also notice that something has been happening in the climate system. And then when they could link it to the rising of CO2, it's not the developing countries who have caused this to happen, but it's from historical emissions as well that has been causing all these impacts that farmers and also women and also developing countries have to live with. And a very unique experience from farmer is a mango tree has been dying while standing like this. They haven't seen this before during their grandmother's time. So even though it's not just dying and lying on the floor, but it's growing, but you have a stalk, a tree, but all dying and all drying, getting dry because of drought, a long period of drought. So imagine how are they going to invest on the new mango tree? That would also cost a lot, because in order to get fruits from the mango tree, you need to grow a mango for 8 years. And during 8-year periods, you have to put all the resources and the cash and also other stuff in order to make money out of this mango tree. So the social impacts and social implications on this would also happen after the drought period. And the same thing with plums and also in different plums as well. So all these impacts are already happening and communities are already doing something. And the question to many of us, which is like, people have to do on their own, using their own expenses, their money in the pocket in order to survive, in order to adapt themselves. Is that a punishment to them? They are not causing these impacts, but they are the one bearing most of the impacts from the historical emissions. So they also need the support in order to survive. So they need to conserve and also do make some trying to maintain their forest in order to have more water for their drought period and for the general consumption. And they are doing something a very typical way, growing in the growing trees and vegetations in the egg peel, and doing kind of the changing cropping period or even growing vegetation in the floating stuff, so that when water comes, it could float and less water to water all these vegetations. So a number of ways that people and communities are doing. Even they are getting into the system of energy, because they are relying on water and they have to use diesel, for example, in order to run the diesel generator to water all the rice and also the vegetations and also the fruit crops. So they invest by themselves on solar energy. So these are something that communities have already done by themselves using their own money. And also trying to dry some of the fruits like banana, rather than using electricity from traditional and conventional source like coal and natural gas or any types of fossil fuels. They are investing on their own using solar in order to heat bananas. So all of these are the fact that impacts are already underway. Communities have already felt strongly about it. And they could even observe, and they have evidence to show that it's not natural. They're not talking about natural disaster as it used to be, but it's more because of the rising temperature, because of the fossil fuel industries, and also because of the historical emissions that has been happening long way since history. And they are getting more impact on those. And not just only having more impacts that they have to bear with, they have to invest on something that also, in order to survive by themselves. And these are also not being supported. And why is this be something like punishment to them? They are not the one causing it. So those who have caused all these emissions, and also those who fail to reduce their emissions very sharply, need to pay for it. So that's how reparation is coming in. So we really need to get the finance and also all those who have been causing the climate impacts to these farmers to pay for this. And we call for them to not only provide the finance, give the finance, and give the as a reparation for those people who have been in need and also those most vulnerable, so that they could survive. And also, it's not just only the finance for them to adjust themselves to the new system, to the new climate systems, but also for them to invest and also to use the new sources of energy, which is not harmful, for example, using renewables. So it's the finance and also the reparation as part of the finance to both mitigation and also on adaptations. And also, even though that you have all the resources to do and to reduce emissions, impacts are still going on. So that could also mean more finance needs to be coming in, because these you cannot stop the impacts that has been on the way. So communities would also need to continue adapting and also adjusting themselves and also building their resilience to the impacts that will be happening, regardless of the rapid onsets or the slow onsets. So those would have to be provided by those, especially those who have been causing the climate impact. And with this, I would think that it's not just only me or Thailand, but it's also shared with also local communities who's also really want to voice their concerns and also their demands on the climate finance and the reparation, because those who are causing the climate impacts needs to pay. And it has to be directly channeled to those who have been vulnerable and at the climate risk. So, and with that, I, in my story of sharing in terms of the impacts on the ground and the need to have the reparation for climate debt. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Wanun, and thank you for bringing us back to say to the hard reality in the global south, where we see the impact of the climate crisis is very obvious, and say stories of the droughts and flooding is indeed something that we often don't say realize here in the global north. I think your stories are very concrete and very very talking in the sense that to stress the urgent need, and I also observed that there was already say a good discussion in the chat, so people really feel free to put your observations there while say listening to the speakers, and I have a fourth person to present to you. That's Leah Achampong from Eurodat. What I read is that Leah joined Eurodat quite recently, last year, but she has been active on climate finance for the last 10 years, more about. So working with WWF and also with CAN Europe before. Eurodat is a network of 59 civil society organizations from 28 European countries. So I can say that also 1111 is one of the members of Eurodat. Leah will in fact focus on current campaigns. What are the main demands in the climate finance campaigns, and what are our challenges for 2021 and beyond? Leah, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Chris. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Leah, as Chris said, and I work at Eurodat on international climate finance. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this webinar, and to all of the speakers who have already highlighted what's at stake. I was invited to outline some of the campaign and advocacy opportunities in 2021, but I also wanted to outline some worrying trends that severely need to be addressed. One of the targets from the least developed countries group is to have at least 70% of climate finance going to support local level climate action by 2030. Yet Oxfam's 2020 analysis of data on climate finance shows that there is a clear difference between where climate finance is most needed on the ground by vulnerable communities and where it actually goes. And in some cases, climate finance is being simultaneously over-reported by some climate finance providers and under-reported by others. The Independent Working Group on Climate Finance estimates this over-reporting amounts to between 3 and 4 billion US dollars. So it's a significant amount. Additionally, data shows that the majority of climate finance is being provided in the form of loans. This is data from the OECD, the Organization on Economic Cooperation and Development. As we know, when finance is provided in the form of loans, this increases a country's vulnerability to unsustainable debt levels. So all of these worrying trends show that the priorities, concerns, and realities of climate vulnerable countries and communities are often fully not reflected in the agendas of the many international fora that are convened to tackle climate change, which begs the question, how can current climate action be considered just and equitable if all impacted stakeholders aren't able to adequately contribute to the debate? So it's clear that with regards to the climate and debt crises, coupled with COVID-19, that they are all mutually reinforcing each other and that the end result is always negative. And as Lydie and Wanun have said, it's mainly traditionally marginalized communities who experience these issues the worst, including women, children, Indigenous communities. In order to ensure that the debt and climate finance dynamics don't continue to conflate each other, there are some opportune moments coming up this year to ensure that climate finance demands around scalability, access to finance, and the quality of finance, as well as demands on debt sustainability, can be jointly addressed. Relevant international meetings on this include the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow in November, COP26, as Lynn has already highlighted. COP26 is a clear opportunity for policy and advocacy and joint debt and climate campaign work, as it provides an opportunity for all relevant stakeholders, not only the richest nations, but all stakeholders, to discuss the duality of these crises. Specifically, the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance will be holding discussions on methodologies to determine the finance needs of developing countries. There will also be the discussions around a new global climate finance goal, which is due to start at COP26. And that new climate finance goal will start from a floor of 100 billion USD. There's also the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which has also been identified as a space for discussion on highlighting the dynamics between climate impacts and debt issues, with a view to securing a finance mechanism to disperse finance to address losses and damages. And something else to note is that the UK is the COP26 presidency, and they have released their priorities on public climate finance. And in it, they highlight debt dynamics 10 times, which is significant for any COP presidency. So clearly, this is an issue that is, through all of the CSO, civil society work that's been done, that is now on the agenda of COP presidencies. And we should be working to try and keep it there, as well as see that this nexus is addressed. Other opportunities to work on the joint climate and debt nexus include the International Monetary Fund. In 2021, the IMF will be reviewing its debt sustainability mechanisms to integrate climate aspects. This is an opportunity to ensure that climate vulnerabilities, climate risk, and climate impacts are reflected upon by the IMFs. There's also the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which will take place in October of this year, and climate forms a big part of that agenda, and is an institution. The UNCTAD is an institution that's currently being chaired by Zambia, so it's an opportunity to ensure that the interlinkages are raised at a high level. There's also the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, again an opportunity to ensure that this coalition of finance ministers don't just use this as a space for discussion and knowledge sharing, but instead use it as a space to connect to strong discussions on effective climate efforts that are taking place between the G20 finance ministers as well. I'll leave, those are just some of the international moments in 2021. There are several others, but what that list shows, it doesn't take into account long-term moments. For instance, the global stocktake of climate efforts in 2023. However, that's because these crises urgently need to be addressed now. For Eurodad, some of the key policy and advocacy messages to drum home are that there needs to be democratic ownership of climate finance strategies. This is a necessity. For climate action to be equitable and driven by the needs of the most vulnerable, it's imperative that climate vulnerable countries are empowered to design policies to suit their own specific circumstances and domestic needs, as opposed to the priorities of other economies. Public climate finance needs to be in the form of grants. Climate vulnerable countries for the last decade have been saying that they no longer have the capacity to sustainably absorb loans. They've reached breaking point, and this has become clear by the amount of countries that are highlighting that are highlighted as being in debt distress. Loans increase a country's susceptibility to debt, which then reduces their ability to adapt and to address loss and damage, or to invest in public services and social protection, all of which sparks a cycle of climate impacts-induced debt, which leads to climate-induced climate vulnerabilities, and then it repeats again. And so it's crucial that climate vulnerable countries have access to a stream of scalable and predictable public climate finance grants. Countries must increase finance for adaptation and to address ongoing losses and damages, particularly because when climate vulnerable countries state and outline what their needs are, they identify that they urgently need access to adaptation finance, including to support adaptation efforts on water, agriculture, and coastal protection. And these countries have also stated that they need access to address severe losses and damages. In order to minimize the impact of loans and debt, mandatory debt payment suspension and debt relief in the immediate aftermath of climate disasters that lead to losses and damages should become a mandatory requirement. But this needs to be coupled with access to additional climate finance to address the gap created by redirecting their budgets to address the immediate extreme climate impacts that they are facing, including losses and damages. Climate finance must also be gender responsive. For this to happen, gender analysis must be conducted to determine the differing needs and interests in society, as well as to determine the accessibility to finance mechanisms and power dynamics. All of this is necessary to develop transformative policies that create deep-rooted, sustained, and positive change. And finally, countries should also be institutionalizing engagement and participation processes. That means all relevant stakeholders, especially marginalized groups within society, should be drawn in to engage in policy and project development and implementation. It's incredibly important to ensure that decision-making policy and project development processes are inclusive in order to support community-based policy development and implementation. I'll stop there and hand back, but I'd be happy to answer any questions and to engage with you more during the discussion part of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, for pointing out some strategic moments and key moments in the climate finance lobby work that has to be done. And I guess you will have a busy year ahead with all these events coming up. But it's good to know that you are not alone and that the climate justice movement is big and strong, and we'll make sure that the voices of the Global South will be heard. I'm inviting now Claire to support speaker. Sorry, I was a bit In fact, Leah was the third speaker, and now we have the fourth speaker is Claire Miranda, also from ABMED. She's a climate finance expert. And in that duty, she's closely monitoring the whereabouts of the Green Climate Fund. Claire is say doing research on the state of play of climate finance delivery. Claire, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you can all see my screen. It's loading.
Yeah.
Yes. So good day, everyone. My name is Claire Miranda from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and I'm so happy to see that more people are now interested in the climate finance discourse, having so many participants in the webinar now. So as you all know, climate finance is an issue that many civil society groups shy away from because the topic tend to be too technical and there are a lot of numbers involved. But I'm hoping after hearing our previous speakers and learning the important role of climate finance delivery in reparations for climate debt, you will now be interested to know what's the latest in terms of climate finance delivery. So a quick disclaimer, there will be a lot of numbers involved, but I'm pretty sure it won't be that much of a problem, especially after learning that only a few or little climate finance pledges have been delivered thus far. So yeah, I will start. Climate finance, at the moment, there's no internationally agreed definition of climate finance, but we usually refer to it as the financial resources mobilized to support the mitigation and adaptation actions aimed to address the impacts of climate change. The concept is very well recognized by the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as new and additional public funding for developing countries. And all in all, it is based on the principle of CBDR, or common but differentiated responsibility, which basically I think Wanun and Lidi and Lin have talked about this. Basically, the principle recognizes the greater responsibility of northern governments, and this is because of their historical contribution to the climate crisis, also because of the fact that they have the means to provide resources for vulnerable nations, or in UN speak, the developing countries. So given that it was stipulated in the Climate Convention, efforts to push for climate finance delivery have started earlier, but it was only in 2009 when developed countries showed quote unquote serious commitment, when they promised to deliver at least 100 billion per year by 2020. And the following year in Cancun at the COP16, parties agreed to establish the Green Climate Fund, which is now the official financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. I say official financial mechanism because if we talk about the climate finance architecture, it's quite complex. There are several financial flows from other multilateral institutions or bilateral arrangements between governments that are tagged as climate finance. And because there's no internationally agreed definition of climate finance, as long as it has something to do with the environment, even if technically it won't make a dent in addressing climate change, it is referred to as climate finance. But the GCF, which we will discuss more in a few, is under the auspices of the UNFCCC, and thus it is bound by the principles of CBDR, historical responsibility, of equity, and so on and so forth. We will look closely at the GCF later, but moving on, in 2015 at the momentous Paris COP, governments reaffirmed the 100 billion per year goal and even offered a clear roadmap on how to achieve the said goal. But as we all know, it's 2021 now, and we probably might be asking, are we even close to the 100 billion per year target? So we have to find out in the next slide. So these are the climate funds under the UNFCCC. As you can see, there's the Global Environment Facility, the Least Developed Country Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, Adaptation Fund, and then the GCF, or the Green Climate Fund. So all the four funds, the GEF, LDCF, SCCF, and Adaptation Fund, were established before 2009. When developed country governments made the 100 billion promise, which explains why the funding so far for these funds have been quite slow and insufficient. The GEF was established in 1991, but the GEF is basically a fund for all environmental concerns, and climate change is just one focal area, and majority of the projects under the climate change focal area of GEF are all about carbon trading and very mitigation centric. For 2 decades of operations, it has mobilized a total of 20 billion from 40 developed countries. The LDCF and SECF, these are special funds for LDC countries and small island development states, but basically LDCF is for the development and implementation of LDC countries, NAPAs, or the National Adaptation Plan of Action of LDC countries, while the SECF is for technology transfer and other assistance for LDCs and SIDS. Both funds are managed by the GEF and have mobilized a very little amount of 1.6 billion and 354 million only. The Adaptation Fund, on the other hand, was established in 2001, but it started its operations in 2009. So notice the 8-year gap when the fund was in limbo. Its funding source is from developed countries, from private donations, like I believe the UN has contributed a small amount to the fund as well. Also, 2% of CDM, or the Clean Development Mechanism proceeds, are channeled to the Adaptation Fund. So, and as you can see, despite the calls for more adaptation support, because adaptation is really important, especially for the vulnerable nations, only 957 million has been raised for Adaptation Fund. The Green Climate Fund is the youngest among them. It was only established in 2010 and started its operations, meaning it started approving funding proposals in 2015. So far, there are 45 contributing countries, but unlike other funds, there are 5 developing countries that pledge to the GCF. And to date, the fund has a total of approximately $20 billion of pledges. Please note that these are pledges, declared pledges, and not the actual amount delivered to the fund. We will talk about that in a few, but because there are countries who haven't fulfilled their pledges to the fund. Also, it is important to note that the GCF, compared to others, is mandated to equally support both adaptation and mitigation. And if we do a little math and add the total amount of resources from these climate funds, we are looking at around 42.9 billion only, which is very far from the 100 billion per year target that was promised in 2009. And these are just the declared pledges, not the actual amount delivered. So let's take a closer look at the GCF, the official financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. So it took 5 years from its establishment in 2010 before the GCF started approving funding proposals, because the GCF has carefully set standards and safeguards against environmental and social risks, as well as consider the rights of women and indigenous peoples. And civil society is a very played a huge role in the crafting and drafting of these policies, of the gender and IP policies, as well as the environment and social safeguards policies of the GCF. In terms of resource mobilization, the GCF has conducted 2 processes already. So for the first one, also known as the, what happened there? For the first one, of resource mobilization, which is also known as the IRM, this was done in 2014. The fund was able to raise a total of 10.3 billion pledges. And this is the tricky part, because this is what they tell the world, 10.3 billion. But of the 10.3 billion, 2 billion was not fulfilled by the US. So I'm sure many of you know this already. During the Obama administration, they pledged to a total of 3 billion to the GCF. But when Trump held office and withdrew from the Paris Agreement, also ordered to stop any financial support for climate, the 2 billion was nowhere to be found. And then, as the GCF continued with its operations approving climate projects, it started running out of funds. Hence, what they call as the replenishment period commenced in 2019. And so far, a total of 9.5 billion pledges were made, so a little less than what was raised during the first round. Some contributing European governments claim to have doubled their pledges to somehow cover for the absence of the US, Australia, and other countries who decided to withdraw support to the Green Climate Fund. But again, the numbers we're talking here about are only declared pledges of contributing countries. If we look at the current status and examine how much has been actually delivered to the fund, you will see that it's only 11.6 billion. So as explained in the IRM, 2 billion minus the 2 billion of the US, only 8.2 billion has been raised. And in the GCF1 or the replenishment period, the current executive director of the Green Climate Fund is very proud to say that they have mobilized a total of 9.5 billion, but in reality, less than half has been delivered to the GCF, only 3.4 billion so far, which leads us to only 11.6 billion in 7 years of operation of the GCF. And then let's dive deeper to the financial instruments implemented by the fund. Again, just to reiterate, the GCF operates under the auspices of the UNFCCC, and under the convention, it clearly states that developed countries, those that are most responsible for the climate crisis, they should be providing climate finance for those who are least responsible. The funds in the GCF, ideally, we want them to be 100% grants-based. This has been mentioned by Leia already and by Lidi, but as you can see, only 43% are in the form of grants. The rest are in loans, in results-based payments, in equities and guarantees. In terms of expenditure and disbursement, the huge chunk of the funds collected in the GCF are spent in climate projects, so 83.4%. So far, there are 173 approved climate projects already. And as mentioned, the GCF is mandated to equally support adaptation and mitigation, meaning funding allocation should be 50-50. However, the fund's portfolio, current portfolio, is skewed towards mitigation projects at 64%, and 36% are in adaptation projects. In terms of who are accessing the fund, so the GCF has a total of 103 partners eligible to implement GCF projects, or what they call as the accredited entities. To become an accredited entity, you have to meet all the standards and requirements of the GCF, which many believe are quite complex and tedious, but for other established institutions like the multilateral development banks, the international organizations, it is easy for them to get accredited and access the funds. So far, at the moment, there are 62 direct access entities. They comprise majority of the partners of the GCF. The direct access entities are the organizations or institutions that are based in developing countries, and having a direct access entity is actually a feature of the GCF that they believe strengthens country ownership. In previous years, there are only few direct access entities in the GCF because, as mentioned, the process is quite tedious. So far, but there was a strong push among developing country board members, also with CSOs, to simplify the approval process and prioritize DAEs. That's why we have more DAEs now. But despite the quantity, despite all these 62 DAEs, are only receiving 1.6 billion of the total GCF funding. 37 projects have been approved from direct access entities so far, and mostly these are micro to small projects. Whereas compared to the international access entities, which are the usual MDBs, the UN agencies, all these institutions that have been implementing climate programs and projects for several years already, they have been dominating the GCF now. So far, 136 projects have been approved with 78% of funding allocation. Also, very important to note that of this 78%, it is concentrated only to 5 institutions. And these are EBRD, the European Bank for Rural and Reconstruction and Development, UNDP, and then we have World Bank, ADB, and FAO. Apparently, these institutions may be claim to implement projects in the Global South and help the Global South, but they are paid to do so. I mean, for every project implemented by these institutions in developing countries, a significant amount is spent for their administrative fees. Then let's look at the contributions thus far. So the table on the right shows, the table on the right shows the breakdown of the declared pledges so far for GCF, the GEF, and the Adaptation Fund. And then the last column is like the total contributions of each country. The diagram, the circles, shows us that the Japan, US, Germany, and UK are the top climate finance pledgers. Climate finance pledgers meaning all these three climate finance funds under the UNFCCC. But I want you to take a closer look at the GCF column, and so far, UK tops the list and has pledged the most at a little over $3 billion. But again, these are declared pledges. So let's look at the real amount delivered so far. So Japan still leads, but primarily because of its contributions to the GEF, followed by Germany. And now you can see that the US's actual contribution to the GCF is only $1 billion, and it never contributed to the Adaptation Fund. And if you can recall from the previous slide, UK has the largest GCF pledge at a little over $3 billion. But if we are to compare it with its actual contributions to the fund, it's just almost half of its pledge. I encourage you to take note of these numbers for comparison to our next slide. And also these diagrams and table, I'm nearing the end of my presentation. So these diagrams and table just tell us how serious these developed countries are in terms of climate finance delivery. They promised in 2009 the 100 billion per year target, which is, by the way, very insufficient if we are to compute the total costs of adaptation, mitigation, loss, and damage needs of the developing world. We're talking about trillions of dollars, actually. In Paris, they claimed they're committed and even gave us a roadmap, but they never fulfilled their promise. Even with the pledges that they declare in the GCF, in GEF, in Adaptation Fund, they seem to derail the plans of fulfilling these pledges. Leah has touched on this in climate negotiations at every COP. Every COP is supposedly a finance COP to ensure the delivery of climate finance, but developed countries seem to always succeed with their tactics and ploy of avoiding progress related to finance. If these numbers don't convince you that we need to take up climate finance or amplify our calls for reparations for climate debt, maybe the next slide will encourage you. So amid the avoidance, the derailment, the deception of climate finance delivery, we have this. This chart is from Oil Change International, showing us the billions of dollars spent by G20 countries in fossil fuel activities. So compare the billions of dollars spent in this chart to the meager amount pledged and delivered to the GCF and other climate finance mechanisms under the UNFCCC. And then we also have the big corporations spending more and more finance for fossil fuel. So this is my last slide, and in a nutshell, this is what's happening in the climate talks. This is like the summary state of play. There's the avoidance of the developed countries. The avoidance of developed countries' responsibility, especially on climate finance, has been very evident for several years already, which is a good basis for what Leah has just presented in terms of how we as movements and civil society groups are going to take this forward in our respective work and campaigns. In APMDD, apart from engaging with the GCF together with other CSOs, with Wanon actually is the alternate active observer for the Green Climate Fund. So apart from engaging with the GCF, we try to raise our calls on reparations. As mentioned by Lydie, we call out governments in every key political moment to honor their fair shares. We continue demanding urgent delivery of climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. It's indeed interesting to see and compare these numbers. And I think also in the some of the questions in the chat were also yeah, where do we get in fact all this climate finance from? Because we can see that the needs are huge. In fact, the historical debt that say industrialized countries are owning to the global south is huge. But of course, the funds have to be raised now, and I think there is indeed the big hesitation also from say industrialized countries to commit. I think, but let's maybe that would be also interesting, say, topic to hear from say the four speakers. I mean, how do we really say put more pressure on the on this say supposed commitments? Maybe Lynn, can you talk a bit through that, because you were suggesting like say a kerosene tax or a CO2 tax. Is that still on the table in Europe?
I think so. The first thing is holding countries accountable, because they have these obligations and they should just meet these targets. So I think that's one aspect. And then there's a discussion in the chat that I think is interesting, that we are all struggling with this fair share calculation. So we are all struggling to hold our own governments accountable, because there is no common agreed framework. And I think that could be something interesting to work on together as CSOs from all over the world, to have this framework and to apply it to all the countries that need to give climate finance, to have a common advocacy objective. And because then the one country cannot say that we don't trust this calculation, or because if you have a common calculation, at least we have a common advocacy goal. Because we have also within Europe, we have already noticed that when it comes to, for example, last year's GCF replenishment, where Claire was talking about, there was a discussion like, should we ask for a doubling of last time? And there for us, that was not a good question, because the last contribution of Belgium was so low that we want more than a doubling. And then some countries did do more, and so their doubling was a good ask. And so they were then struggling with what should our common ask be. And so if there we then have a common framework and say, okay, for this country it should be this, for this country it should be this, I think that would be a very helpful tool. But then next to that, as Claire also mentioned, 100 billion is not enough. So this is the commitment of countries at this point, but I think we should also be starting to think about other mechanisms to ensure that this finance is going to loss and damage, to adaptation finance directly. And then there you can think of a kerosene tax or a climate damages tax on companies that are actually still extracting and even looking for new reserves of fossil fuels, to go directly to these kind of causes, to avoid these governments that are not doing enough. So I think there might also be some opportunities to start lobbying on that, because the question that you ask are these discussions happening? I think the question is, the answer is no. On like real discussions, real negotiations on these kind of taxes are not happening, and I think it should be, the case.
Yeah. Thank you, Lee. Does anyone want to add on that? Maybe Lydie, yeah?
Yeah. So actually that's getting the governments of the North or developed countries to talk about climate finance is even harder than to get them to talk about fossil fuels. And you know that it's so hard, in fact, to get them to talk about fossil fuels. The entire Paris Agreement doesn't even use that phrase, fossil fuels. So you can imagine. And there has been consistently refusal to engage on the question of what should be fair shares in general, let alone fair shares in terms of climate finance. Just to also say that one of the huge issues around the Paris Agreement is for the US to sign on, which it later withdrew from and now it's back. For the US to sign on the Paris Agreement, it made a condition that there should be no talk about liabilities or compensation or finance for loss and damage. So that's even a bigger challenge for us, talking about climate finance, but then they only want to talk about it in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation. That's why the Green Climate Fund is only supposed to balance its funding for adaptation and climate finance. So I think there's a lot of very good points in the chat about how we can equip ourselves better as CSOs. I think the first thing that we should do, because it's going to be a long shot to get all governments to agree on a common methodology, let alone a common evaluation of how they're going to contribute, what their fair share will be, is for us to develop ourselves, civil society, our own methodologies and calculations of what fair shares should be based on science and so on, and be able to argue from that point. So there's a lot of good ideas, things that some of which are similar to what we've been thinking about. But we really have to get into that job kind of urgently. And one of the things that I'd really like to invite participants to do is please do focus some of your work and your energies on climate finance. There are very few civil society groups working on climate finance as compared to those working on energy and energy transition, for instance. We don't want to lessen the focus on energy. We just need to increase also the focus on climate finance. And for that, we're very grateful that there are other groups now being convinced. And so maybe it's high time that we convene a meeting at some point to discuss about this calculator and how we can, show to individual governments that this is what you should be committing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lydie. There was also a question in the Q&A on odious, say, fossil fuel debts, and especially related to, say, finance from international financial institutions. This is, let's say, public money going to the fossil fuel sector, and what actions are say happening there in related to the, say, civil society organizations. I don't know, Leah, would you like to tackle that, or is that not your
Yeah, I
cup of
can.
tea?
Yeah, I can certainly come in on this point. I'd say that you're definitely correct in highlighting that certain or quite a lot of the multilateral development banks haven't been engaging in these discussions around climate and debt issues to the extent that we would like to see. But we are seeing some changes being made. For instance, the European Investment Bank has highlighted that it will be divesting out of fossil fuel subsidies by the end of this year. And then there's also the announcements by the UK and USA to also say that they will stop providing international fossil fuel subsidies to climate vulnerable countries as well. However, in a lot of cases, it doesn't cover fossil fuel portfolios as a whole. In some cases, they're only focusing on the sort of traditional baddies of oil and coal, which are very, very necessary. However, what we're seeing is that gas is a fossil gas that is being left out of this fossil fuel divestment aspect, which is not helpful. I would say that it's for developed countries and public and multilateral development banks to stop providing financial subsidies for new fossil fuel investments and to phase out subsidies for all existing finance and existence for fossil fuels. Any measures that are developed domestically by developed countries to reform their internal financial structure cannot be undermined by that country's international activities, and so they shouldn't be continuing to provide international fossil fuel subsidies. That's why the announcements by the UK and USA are so helpful. However, as I say, gas is one of those fossil fuels that is typically not included within this. I do think, however, that it's important to highlight that that there needs to be more research conducted and independent assessments conducted to to determine the impact of energy poverty reducing measures and the transition to cooking with clean electricity and sustainable renewables. For structures like the Clean Cooking Alliance, they state that gas is needed for clean cooking. So I would say that there's a need to look at the impact of using gas for clean cooking and conduct and carry out independent assessments to determine what the impact of transitioning to clean electricity and sustainable renewables would be. I also think that it's important to minimize the impact of fossil fuel subsidy reform on climate vulnerable countries, particularly those that are fossil fuel generating countries. And I think that one way to do this is by coupling fossil fuel subsidy reform with a just transition fund. So as Liddy was saying in the chat function, there's a need to repurpose fossil fuel subsidies for climate as climate finance. And I would say that I agree with this, and that when restructuring fossil fuel subsidies for climate finance, that this needs to be structured in a way to support counter-cyclical opportunities for climate vulnerable countries and communities to support their transition to net zero carbon economies. And so that should include things like smart retirement of certain industries, including the gas industry. There's no need for there to be new gas infrastructure being built or for finance to be getting directed towards gas, but it also means the smart retirement of industries such as coal and oil as well. There also needs to be taking into account the workers as well. So it's about reskilling workers from these industries too, and supporting new industry growth, including through things like subsidies and incentives for industries to focus on not low carbon, but zero carbon technologies, and to redesign their processes as well. I think low carbon and the term green and sustainable are being hijacked by industry for their own means, which is how we get this prevalence of gas, because it's seen as low carbon, but it still emits carbon. So it's not the right direction that we should be heading towards. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Indeed, I think you're going back a bit also to the discussion we had yesterday and during our other panel discussion. We were talking about the just transition and all the components there, and you tackled indeed some of the very key issues there. Liddy, you were raising your hand as well?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to just briefly address some of the questions raised in the Q&A. Yeah. Escaping market fix and infrastructural fix traps in demanding climate responsibility. That means we really need to engage not just in the broad calls, but also engage on the specifics. For instance, we campaigned a long time for climate finance and the setting up of a global climate fund in order to ensure the disbursement of climate finance, not through the World Bank and not through the regional development banks, because it's the lenders and the northern governments that are dominating these institutions. So we couldn't just stop there. We are now engaging the Green Climate Fund with all the details about what's happening to the funds and how it's going to be dispersed. And that's the only way you can make sure that you don't only get the amounts, small as they are, we still need to make sure that these are also used and dispersed in the proper way. Just on the debt question of John, we're saying that, yes, part of our call for cancellation of debts is cancellation of debts that went to harmful projects like fossil fuels. So part of the call on debt is not just the unsustainable debt, but the illegitimate debts that were used to finance these harmful projects. And part of that should then go to climate finance, the funds that are liberated from the cancellation of debts. And then just on the question of Erwin on filing an international case before the UN to compel states to fulfill. That's an interesting prospect. We haven't looked at that carefully, but the first question would be, which courts will we put this before? And you know, maybe the International Criminal Court is one. If we are able to say that, you know, the failure to provide their climate finance obligation is actually leading to the millions of lives lost and millions of properties lost.
And it's maybe, who knows, it can be linked also with the ecocide, say, or the campaigns to introduce ecocide as a criminal, say, act, and that can also be internationally, say, legally pursued. That would be interesting in that to check. I'm looking at the time. We started a little bit late, so in fact we are. Yes, Leah. Yeah, I think indeed you can also come in. I think also what Lynn also in the chat highlighted is this the non-proliferation treaty. I think APMD is also has also signed that say that treaty
Yes,
and the
thank
charter.
you for raising that.
Yeah,
Leon, we're in the International Steering Committee of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for Fossil Fuels. So Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative.
Yeah.
So there's the link that Leon put there in the chat. Please do get in touch with us.
Yeah, great. Leah, yes, please come in.
Yeah, I wanted to come in on Erwin's point and highlight a point where I think there can be CSO engagement in. So in the COP21 decision under the UNFCCC, paragraph 51 states that Article 8 of the agreement, Article 8 is on loss and damage, does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. This essentially is what developing countries try and use to ensure that they can't be held responsible or accountable for the losses and damages that climate vulnerable countries have, are, and will experience, either by way of compensation or by legal means. This is a paragraph that the USA has tried at COP25 to use to block action on climate finance to address loss and damage. And I think this is because there have been more and more legal cases that are being made against governments in the last few years. In 2019, 3/4 of the legal cases made against governments were made in the USA. And so I do think that there are options and opportunities for us to push back against the use of such paragraphs and texts at a national level. I don't know how this can be done at an international level, but I'm sure that we can reach out to organizations like the Center for International Environmental Law, but also organizations like Client Earth as well, because clearly these types of paragraphs are not consistent with the UN's equity principles or with the purpose of tackling climate action. And in countries that are trying to use such paragraphs are not taking into account the vulnerabilities that vulnerable communities and countries are facing.
Yeah, thank you for that additional information. I think I don't see other questions popping up. Lynn, yes, would like to add?
Yeah, I have a question myself, but I don't know if we still have time. But it's for Claire and for Lydie, I think. So because you presented the work of the GCF, right? And we see in the GCF, because of the principle of a balance in finance for adaptation and mitigation, but also the strong safeguards that were built in because of civil society engagement. I think we consider the GCF as a good instrument to to provide climate finance. But on the other hand, when we are discussing, for example, with the Belgian government, I don't know if it's the case in other countries as well, to increase finance for GCF, they often say, yeah, we don't think that GCF at this point is doing what it should be doing. There are so many problems with the governance, with the management. There are projects being approved that we don't approve of. And so we prefer to give our climate finance via bilateral cooperation. And so, for example, now our new federal government has committed to increase climate finance, but they are doing it by establishing their own projects, for example, in the Sahel region. And so you see there that if it's going to be all bilateral, that it's going to be based on countries' own, how do you say, economic and other
preference.
Preferences. So I think we should be pushing, towards more focus on these international funds that have that are under the UNFCCC, so have these equity principles and all of that. But how would you answer to that question? Do you agree that the GCF at this point is not sufficient, that it should be improved? And do you agree that that is a reason for now not to increase finance to these funds?
Claire, you want to go first?
Okay. So thank you, Lynn. Just to answer that, the GCF is not perfect. I mean, there are still ways to improve the GCF, but I think that excuse is common among developed country board members because they're using that excuse to really, to avoid again the responsibility of really putting in more money to the GCF. Because as we all know, the GCF is for the developing countries, regardless of whether the policies are there are governance issues, they still have to fulfill their obligations and they still have to put in money in the GCF. And it's a debate between the developing and developed country board members because developed country board members are really fixated with fixing the policies that are in place, improving constantly, adding in more requirements so that it's quite difficult for the developing country accredited entities or the DAEs that I've mentioned to access the fund because there are more and more requirements that are set because of this push from developed country board members. The developing country board members, on the other hand, from the outside, from the observer's point of view or from the public, they seem to derail the process because they often reject all the proposals of these developed country board members, all these excuses. They try to reject that and push really for the replenishment of the fund because the fund is running. There are more climate projects that are needed in the developing countries, and yet these developed countries or the contributor countries are trying to avoid the responsibility and setting all these standards and policies and fixated with all these policy gaps that they claim. And Lydie, if you have anything more to add.
Yeah, well, it goes back to our problem at the very beginning, when developed country governments in the transition committee that was designing the Green Climate Fund for approval by the COP insisted on housing the new climate fund. It wasn't called the Green Climate Fund yet, into the existing international financial institutions, which we all know developed countries have dominance in the governance structures, are also practicing a lot of, attaching a lot of conditionalities to fund disbursements. So one big fight that we were all engaged in was in fact the proposal of the US and many countries from the North in the transitional committee was to house it in the World Bank. So now you have the Green Climate Fund that they cannot dominate completely because it's a 50-50 mix in the governance structure. There's really very strong dynamics in the board. That is true because we're not saying that developing country board members are always right. Now, there are issues where it's the developed country board members that are actually sharing some of our similar concerns. But there is that dynamic. That there is these policies that are being pushed by developed countries, and they leverage those in order not to give contributions, or to, to say that they're not going to give their contributions unless these policies are put in place. And then you have also the developing countries pushing back and being painted as the ones that are trying to derail the process, when what they're doing is pushing back, and oftentimes rightly so, in many of these conditions that are being imposed. So it's really an institution that is struggling with a lot of these difficulties, but that is also because there are many conflicts and contradictions in the interests of both camps. So there's that dynamic, and civil society as independent participants in this process. We are, of course, not as powerful as the governments who are sitting there as a board. We also have to make our own independent positions and analysis of these issues that are arising from the board. But after all is said and done, it's still the better option for climate finance flows than for northern governments to pick and choose who they're going to give the money to, how it's going to be spent, because that really negates the principles of climate finance under the Climate Convention, and especially as reparations.
Yep, actually,
Thank you.
And also Claire, of course, for this reply. I think, yeah, I'm sorry a bit about Wanun. You were a bit left out of the discussion now. So if you would have any, say, I think we should wrap up here. I think people are slowly leaving. But as Wanun was not, say, involved in the Q&A, I would like to give her the last word, and then we wrap up. Wanun, are you still with us? Hello. Okay. Manu, are you still there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, do you have a final word? I mean, is there something you learned today, or is it something that you say you would like to pick up from this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it's of course, I mean, in terms of what is really needed for us developing countries, for us to go more and be equipped with all the knowledge and also technologies to adapt ourselves and to increase our adaptive capacities in order to deal with the impacts of climate change. And also, we are not forgetting that some of the countries in developing countries in the global south are also paving the way to grow. So that would mean also consuming more energy. So what type of energy sources governments and us will be choosing, would also define how, would also have an implication on the increasing CO2 pricing as well. So in that case, I mean, the finance would also be needed, not just only for adaptation, but also for mitigation. And this finance has to come very quickly. So those who have been causing climate impacts need to come and meet their obligations and also pay for those pay for those climate debts, and also for us to also help reduce the emissions, and also to adapt ourselves to the impact of climate change, and also to address effectively on the loss and damage that has been caused by climate impacts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anu. I think we can close the session here. I would like to thank the panelists a lot for say their very fruitful contributions. I think it was a good moment of exchange and reflection, and there was also it was nice to see that a lot of ideas and links were shared in the chat box. So I think these links will also be made available on the AEPF website later on. And also the video will also be available in a few days' time on the APF website. And for people who cannot say wait to share, I think it's the video was also in Facebook Live, so there that can also be viewed in Facebook on the, I think also on the APMD web say Facebook page, I guess. So there are many ways to trace back the wise words that have been spoken here, and I think that very informative session. So thanks a lot, Leah, Wanun, Lily, Claire, Lynn, and I hope to see you sometime later for another discussion, because I'm afraid this topic will not be solved by next year. So who knows who we might be back anytime soon to elaborate further on this. Thanks a lot, and
Thank you, everyone.
for those people,
Everyone.
for those people
All the
who want to go on with the AEPF sessions, please check the website. There are many more interesting panels to come. So we might also see you there. Goodbye. Have a nice day and good evening
Thank you.
in Asia. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.